Hi, I'm Dr. Judy St. Ledger. I'm a veterinary pathologist at SeaWorld, and I'd like to share with you today some gross photos of some diseases of fishes that I hope you'll find interesting. More importantly, I hope you find educational and informative to you as you consider looking at the pathology of fishes. Let's take a look at the slides. Now, a presentation like this isn't ever put together with the slides from one person. It really requires a lot of input from other exceptional individuals within the field. And just like these jellies, a lot of people came together to make things come together for this presentation for you today. What I'd like to do is to take a look at these conditions by the etiologic classification of diseases. So let's start with some of the bacterial diseases of fishes with important gross findings. I'd like to start out sort of with an up-close and personal look on the inside of a fish. And I'd like to do it because people say to me, oh, fish pathology is so different, I can't really relate to it. And I actually think that you can. And I think what's important is to realize that fish, just like mammals that you may know, have a limited spectrum of lesions for infectious diseases. Here what we're looking at is the liver and the spleen from a salmonid. And what we're looking at is the acute lesions of Eromonas septicemia. So Eromonas salmonicida has a number of different disease presentations, and one of them is acute septicemia. This is a major aquaculture pathogen, and it's a kind of pathogen that you should be familiar with and thinking about if you have salmonids that are demonstrating septicemic lesions. Now, what's important about this is that there's a bit of a classic lesion associated with Eromonas salmonicida infections. And the common name for this condition is furunculosis. Now, the cool thing about this is, in the word for the day, sort of basis of life, furuncle can be your word for the day. These are furuncles. Looking at this slide, what we have here, and I apologize, I'm going to get that arrow eventually. What we have here are some areas where we have sort of almost cavitating lesions that are extending from the skin into the underlying musculature. A furuncle is a raised area of tissue that has sort of a soft center. So it's not a candy, it's a kind of a lesion that's associated with an Eromonas infection in fishes, specifically salmonids, so Eromonas salmonicida. Now, like many pathogens you know, Eromonas salmonicida doesn't simply stick with salmonids for its infection. The condition in koi or cyprinids is called goldfish ulcerative disease. And in these fish, ulcerations are common, and actually demonstration of the furuncles is much less common. Here's a better picture sort of looking along the side of a koi, and what you can appreciate here is we have multiple ulcerations with areas of peripheral red congestion and hemorrhage. This is a freshwater bacterial infection, and again, we see a number of different forms. The peracute or sudden death, the acute, where we see the multi-organ necrosis like we saw sort of in that first presentation, and the more chronic lesions where we have cutaneous ulceration with extensive cellulitis and associated myositis. In cyprinids, there actually is a commercial vaccine that's available, so there are ways to sort of deal with these infections. Now remember, when we're doing different pathogens in different fishes, we may get different names, but it's essentially the same disease. Take a look at the tail of this flounder. Well, this is a clever condition. This is flounder ulcer disease. And again, you can appreciate what we have here is the development of a small furuncle that will secondarily ulcerate and cause the ulcerative disease of Eromonas salmonicida in this flounder. Like with so many bacteria, Eromonas salmonicida has some brothers and cousins. And this is an Eromonas hydrophila infection. Again, another significant pathogen of freshwater fishes. These pathogens are actually part of the normal GI flora, and these infections are often induced by stress. So when we have things like changes in the water quality or changes in the stocking density or sort of changes that really cause stressful events in the lives of fishes, it's not uncommon to secondarily get lesions like this associated with the proliferation of these bacteria. This is a chronic disease really in some of these fishes, and we get ulceration and hemorrhage. Many of these lesions can secondarily become infected with protozoa. So whereas when we talk about mammals, we talk about primary viral conditions secondarily infected with bacteria, when we're thinking about fish, specifically cutaneous infections, it's the aquatic protozoa that commonly invade and cause leftover problems even when the primary etiologic agent is no longer present. An important thing to remember, and something we're going to talk about throughout this lecture, is the impact of water temperature, both on fish immunology as well as pathogen virulence. This condition is significantly impacted by water temperatures, and it's more common in spring and fall. Now, there are some conditions that have some pretty significant species specificity. This is a beautiful picture, and I love it because you could actually name the disease by looking at the picture. What we have here is areas of cutaneous hemorrhage and congestion associated with the areas of the head of the fish, or capital hemorrhage and congestion. This is a condition called enteric red mouth, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see the red mouth. This is an infection with Yersinia ruckeri, or yersiniosis, in a salmonid. Now, this is generally a freshwater condition, but we've actually seen yersiniosis impacting marine species as well. The condition has a variety of presentations, and it's often associated with skin and ocular hemorrhages. We can have the condition called pop-eye in fishes, and we'll look at that a little bit more closely later on. Rainbow trout in particular have a bit of a species sensitivity, and they are particularly sensitive to this infection. There are other salmonids, Atlantic salmon, for example, that are much more resistant to infection with this organism. Now, one of my most memorable cases was a number of marine sharks where we saw sort of these ventral areas of cutaneous ulceration. And when I saw that, I thought, oh, that looks like a Vibrio infection in these animals. But when we looked inside, we noticed that these animals also had a peritonitis as well as multi-organ areas of hemorrhage and necrosis. And I was shocked when we actually cultured Yersinia ruckeri out of these infections as well. The point of the shark infection is not that yersiniosis is a primary pathogen in sharks, but that we need to do more than grossly examine these fishes to determine the cause of the pathogens, because sometimes we can be surprised. Now, do I think that yersiniosis is going to be an emerging developing condition in sharks? I truly don't. And in fact, I suspect there was something primary that sort of led for this unusual infection to develop in those species. I don't know what the primary condition was, but because I know about the pathogenicity of Yersinia, I know I should be looking for a primary pathogen with a secondary sort of unusual infection having occurred in those fishes. Now, just as in all animal species, there are some conditions that you simply need to know because they're so classic and so important. What we're looking at here is a catfish who's been opened up so that you can appreciate the fact that he's got acute necrotizing damage to multiple visceral organs. This is Edwardsiella ictaluri. This is the #1 economic disease of farmed catfish. And what's important about it is that this condition has both a marked seasonality as well as various forms of the disease that have really significantly different presentations that you should know about. The first one is a great one. When I talk about fishes, people often say, oh, you know, fish skin disease is all about white spots all over the fishes. And this is a condition where there's white spots all over the fishes. But this presentation of white spots is very different than the protozoal infections we'll talk about later. What we have here is a catfish that was exposed to Edwardsiella via oral ingestion. And what we find is that via the vascular system, you get areas of cutaneous necrosis multifocally throughout the skin. Those areas then heal. And I think if you look at this fish, you can appreciate we have some active sort of chronic ulcerations, as well as these healed, really sort of what we call milk spots or false spots present on the skin of this catfish. This is the chronic presentation of the acute disease of Edwardsiella in these fishes. So the acute or peracute condition results in these multifocal cutaneous pale spots or ulcerations in the skin. Now, the chronic presentation of this disease is completely different. The chronic presentation is associated with the bacteria actually going up via the nasal organ and causing a meningoencephalitis. And what we have secondary to that meningoencephalitis is this area of necrosis of the frontal bone and ulceration of the overlying skin. This is a neat condition in that I'm very big on making sure you get cultures so that you've got corroborating information to support your pathologic diagnoses. in the first condition, if we want to culture the organism, you culture the kidney, the spleen, or the liver. In this condition, if you want to culture the organism, you need to culture the brain. So in the chronic condition of Edwardiella in catfish, the organism is really sequestered within the CNS, but the lesion extends all the way from the brain through the frontal bone and literally removes the overlying skin. It's a very, very interesting condition. It is interesting in that water temperatures are important in sort of the seasonality of this condition. It's a spring and fall related condition, and again, it has to do with the water temperature. This is an important condition to know, and it's significant and very important, again, in farm catfish. Now, we started with bacterial infections because bacterial infections in fishes are important. We're going to move to salmonids now, away from catfish, and what we're looking at here are the kidneys of a salmonid. And to be honest, I don't know what kind of salmonid this was, but I don't need to, because looking at these kidneys, I can appreciate the granulomatous inflammation here. And if I see granulomatous condition in the kidneys of a salmonid, the first thing that comes to mind for me is bacterial kidney disease. Bacterial kidney disease is a bacterial infection caused by Renibacterium salmonellum. What's important about this is that this is a condition of both wild and farm salmon, and that pathogenicity again is related to water temperatures and stress. This is a condition of concern because we can have issues with hatchery and broodstock. And if we look at an adult fish impacted by this, you can see that sometimes you can have significant changes in a fish that's been ill for quite a period of time. He's got such expansion of his kidneys here that you can actually physically see the enlargement via the outside of the fish. Well, this guy's going to be perfect, unfortunately, for shedding the bacteria via vertical transmission, such that his fry can be impacted right from day one. Losses may not occur in these fishes until the fishes are adults. So it's important as we do hatchery management to make sure that we screen very diligently for this bacterial infection. In these adult fish, there's another sort of related lesion that oftentimes indicates, hey, there may be a concern with this, and that's a condition called spawning rash. Spawning rash is a cutaneous condition where they actually get these vesicles within their skin, and those vesicles can be associated at spawning time with infection with Renibacterium, the agent of bacterial kidney disease in salmonids. I've got this guy in here because of an interesting problem in eels in particular, moray eels in particular. This is an oral granuloma, and moray eels are a particularly susceptible species of fishes that have another granulomatous disease that you should know about, and that is a mycobacteriosis. This is Mycobacterium marinum in a moray eel, and what's important is the lesions can be highly variable. They can vary from these granulomas to a less distinct sort of area of cutaneous ulceration. Sorry, I'm having a tough time with this darn arrow, but I think you can easily appreciate here that this guy has both ulceration with development of a deeper draining tract, and again, that's associated with mycobacteriosis. There are a number of species that have issues with mycobacterial infections. Those include a variety of different eel species. Certainly in the home aquarist, we always worry, specifically in my world, of rainbow fish. But Mycobacterium can impact any fish species and should always be on the rule out for consideration with granulomatous disease. What we're looking at here is some yellow perch. And this picture came to me care of Paul Bowser. And I like the picture because I wanted a nice shot to demonstrate columnaris infections to you. Columnaris is a flexibacteria, and on histology or even wet mounts it's nice because the bacteria form these haystacks, and it's the haystacks you're looking for. The organism is Flavobacterium columnare. Its name's changed 3 times since I've known the bug. But what's important is here we've got both these cutaneous areas of necrosis and ulceration, as well as multifocal areas of gill damage. And typically it's the gill damage I want you to think about, but the cutaneous issues are important as well because there's a specific lesion called saddleback where you can actually get sort of discoloration of the skin just caudal to the dorsal fin, again associated with this infection. One of the problems we have, like so many infections, is when we have the primary bacterial infection, we can end up with secondary fungal infections. And that's actually what happened to these fishes. They had primary gill damage from the columnaris disease, but then they got secondary fungal infections that were invasive into the areas of damaged gills. Columnaris is important because virulence is related both to water temperature and to water hardness. So it's a little bit funky in that water quality is a big issue in these conditions. Now, there are some other conditions that are a little bit funky, but that should make you think about columnaris. Here we're looking at a zebrafish. And the reason that I think everybody should love fish is, obviously fish are important for aquaculture, so they're a food item. They're important for display, so they're an important aquarium item. They're important for the fish hobbyist, so they're an important pet item. And now fish have really come of their own as an important lab animal species. Zebrafish are growing as a laboratory animal species, and here we have a great expression of tail rot or peduncular disease, peduncle disease, that occurs in fishes in temperatures greater than 59 degrees, and it's important in these fishes. And tail rot can be very significant but sort of non-specific. So here we have it in a zebrafish, and as we look at other fishes, it can extend to where the tail is gone, or to where we actually have such extensive loss of the tail that you can actually see the bony rays of the tail that are there. Now, why do I show these different presentations of tail rot? Because in the small freshwater species, certainly I think of columnaris first, but again, there are a variety of pathogens, and you need to consider both this is a freshwater or saltwater fish, and what sort of changes am I seeing as you look sort of on the rule-out list for the variety of pathogens that can cause those kind of problems. There was an excellent paper in 2004 in the Journal of Fish Diseases that came out of Japan. And this is bacterial hemorrhagic septicemia in IU fishes. This is caused by Pseudomonas plecoglossocyta. I like that because it's a hard word to say, so given the fact that I can almost say it, I feel a little bit smart. But I've got this in here because, again, it's a species-specific condition with sort of a non-specific gross finding, but a significant one. If you look here, what we're looking at is the operculum have been removed, so you can see that the gills are both congested and necrotic. And it doesn't take any imagination at all to appreciate we've got ascites, as well as acute liver necrosis and damage to multiple visceral organs. This condition is very significant in these cultured fish, and again, it's simply another bacteria to keep on the list of rule-outs, and a reason that we simply can't throw these fish in a pot of formalin and expect to have the full answer. Now I want to move on to sharks, because in aquarium, commercial aquarium, sharks are the best demonstrators of vibriosis I could ever find. There are a number of vibriosis infections, a number of different species of vibria that are important, but there are a number of marine pathogens that are good to know about. They include Aeromonas, Pseudomonas, Proteus, Citrobacter, and Vibrio. But what's important is, in sharks, we get a variety of lesions associated with these infections. Here we have a sand tiger shark, and that animal was impacted with a bite wound on its tail, and you can appreciate that it's taking a long time to heal and the granular tissue to move in, and that's because we had a significant local Vibrio infection. Unfortunately, in sharks, vibriosis isn't always just localized. We can get septicemia. Certainly here, with the expansion of the vascular size, you can easily appreciate the entire vascular pattern as it goes down the tail of these animals. In particular, we have issues with meningitis in sharks associated with Vibrio infections. So this is an important gram-negative infection associated with skin ulcerations, sometimes abdominal distension, and oftentimes causing both septicemia or specifically meningitis in shark species. But again, it's a common marine pathogen. It's more virulent when the animals are under environmental stress, certainly water quality, as well as in the marine natural environment, pollution can impact these infections. I just want to take a look at another case of Vibrio. Here we have a ray, and what's important is this animal illustrates a need to know a little bit about normals. If you look at this liver, it's a big, well, if you could have looked at that liver, it's a big fatty liver, and that's absolutely normal. These animals don't have a swim bladder, and they use the lipids within their liver for buoyancy. Also normal is the presence of these abdominal pores, but completely abnormal is having fetid brown red fluid pouring out of your abdominal pores. Well, it's pouring out because this animal has a marked purulent abdominal effusion associated with an oophoritis and secondary peritonitis. Here's the animal's uterus, okay? Here's the animal's spiral valve, or essentially the shark's version of a colon, and what we've got is a bacterial infection secondary to an ovarian infection that was demonstrated as a peritonitis in this animal. Let's just take a quick look at some fungal diseases. This is actually a shot from Burning Man a number of years ago, but it shows how significant fish are to the lives of all sorts of people. This is a beautiful picture of saprolegnia. Saprolegnia is a water mold. It's a significant pathogen of catfish in the wintertime, but it can impact numerous fish species. As we talked about earlier, it's an opportunist, so it'll take advantage of any sort of damage associated with parasitic infections, bacterial infections, to really get in there and proliferate. The transmission is via zoospores that are essentially free-floating in the water, so they're highly motile. And it's good at colonizing the gills, ulcerated cutaneous lesions, things like that. The lesion in the gills is a mix, sort of an acute necrotizing bronchitis to areas of proliferation in lesions that are more long-standing with fusion in the secondary lamellae. And regardless of the nature of the lesion, with that much damage in your gills, you're going to have trouble breathing if you're a fish. Now, fish don't always like to be different. Here we have the head of a bonnethead shark, and you can appreciate that he's got a multifocal granulomatous dermatitis. This is a fusarium infection in a shark. And I've just got this in here to demonstrate that sometimes a lesion is just a lesion. Let's take a look at some viral diseases, and fish have many significant viral diseases. I've chosen just a few because they illustrate important points or they demonstrate changes that I really think you should know as you're looking at different fish conditions. Here we're looking at a fish, and this is not a fish trying to imitate Angelina Jolie. The whole front end of this fish is sort of distorted by this very significant proliferative lesion. This is lymphocystis. Lymphocystis impacts both fresh and saltwater fishes, and it's caused by an iridovirus. Now, it's an important infection because the cell that's impacted is generally the dermal fibroblast, but visceral fibroblasts can be impacted as well. It causes, as you can imagine, a significant hypertrophic proliferative change. We can see the nuclear enlargement. There are basophilic cytoplasmic inclusions in these guys. Sometimes there's inflammation, but there was an important comparative pathology paper, 2003, looking at systemic iridoviral infections, and I think it's a good one to take a look at if you're looking to learn more about this significant viral infection in fishes. Let's move on to what people tell me is sort of the dead red fish kind of classification of viruses. And I'd like to start with a dead red fish. This is a channel catfish who's been impacted by channel catfish virus. This is the #1 viral condition of channel catfish. And what we're looking at here, what we should be looking at here, is a number of ventral areas of red congestion and hemorrhage. Certainly you can get both focal to diffuse necrosis of a variety of organs. Hematopoietic and excretory organs are very significantly impacted, and this is a herpes viral infection. This is an interesting infection in that it has an age specificity, and like so many herpes viral infections, it is a condition of little kids. When you're a little kid in the fish world, you're a fry. So small fries and fingerlings in the summertime are the primary kids who are really vulnerable to this infection. Tends to be associated with warm water, and again, necrosis and edema are the real hallmarks of this infection. When we have sort of clinical presentation, it's kind of an erratic swimming within the fishes that are impacted by it. So erratic swimming in the summertime in small catfish fry, think about channel catfish virus. Here's a better picture of a little fry demonstrating ascites. And ascites in fishes is tough to demonstrate because as soon as you open them up, all that fluid seems to pour out of their abdominal cavity. When we see things like epsophthalmos or Popeye in fishes, and it's kind of easy to see in this little kid, you can see that that eye looks like it's 3 times bigger than the poor little guy's head. Well, it looks like that because it's actually distended, and he's got what we call pop eye. When you see exophthalmos and ascites in catfish, think of this lesion. If you see similar problems in salmonids, it'd be good to think about bacterial kidney disease that we talked about earlier. Now, there's a growing interest in fish pathology specifically focused on cyprinids, so carp and goldfish. And what's important is there are 2 important infections in these guys that are often confused but need to be significantly differentiated. And what we're looking at here is the tail end of a goldfish, and you can appreciate what look like wax-like deposits here on the skin. This is carp pox, and this is caused by cyprinid herpes virus 1. Now, this is important because it's a cold water type infection, and it's really a cutaneous plaque. This is very much a lesion of epidermal hyperplasia and a self-limiting lesion. These lesions can come and go, and in the grand scheme of things don't have significant clinical impact on the fishes. Let's compare that to koi herpes virus. Now, koi herpes virus is different matter altogether. What we're looking at here is significant acute necrosis and congestion of the gills, and this can result in marked mortality in these fishes, anywhere from 80 to 100% mortality in the impacted fishes. These guys get secondary bacterial infections, as we talked about earlier. This is a condition specifically of warm water, and what's important again is koi herpes virus, highly significant clinically, commonly fatal, unlike the previous case we just saw. When we're talking dead red, I like to go to the rhabdoviruses of fishes. And I like to go to the rhabdoviruses because there are a number of significant ones, and although the gross presentations are similar, looking at the fish that are impacted and sort of the conditions of that impact will tend to lean you one way or another to a different kind of virus. This shot is of infectious hematopoietic necrosis. It's a virus of salmonids. It's a major cause of salmonid death in freshwater. Specific salmonids that I think of are rainbow trout, sockeyes, Chinook salmon, things like that. This is a rhabdoviral infection, as I said, and what we see is acute necrosis and ascites, edema. It's an important condition because, again, it's a temperature-related condition, but mortality can be extensive, up to 100%. This is a condition where the virus is transmitted from either survivors to other fishes that they're exposed to or via the feed. So it's important, if feeding fish meal, to keep something like this in mind. When you're looking at these animals histologically, this is a nice condition because if we've got a salmonid with intranuclear or intracytoplasmic inclusions present within the pancreatic parenchyma, either the acinar or islet cells, this is probably the first viral infection I would think of. Now let's compare that a little bit with spring viremia of carp. The nice thing about fish diseases is they try to give you a name that gives you a little bit of a lead-in to what kind of fishes you should worry about. This animal, remember we talked about those pop eyes? He's got exophthalmia. You can't really appreciate areas of petechia or hemorrhage, but you can when we look at sort of this grass carp. This is another rhabdovirus, Rhabdovirus carpio. Again, it's a seasonal condition. It occurs in spring and fall. It can be transmitted by the carp louse. We'll talk a little bit more about lice and leeches later on. Mortality is high, and again, sort of non-specific findings, but one in particular that's kind of important when we see it in carp is petechia in the swim bladder. And when we see high mortality, spring and fall, in carp species, if you've got swim bladder petechia, think about spring viremia in carp, okay? Now, I love this guy. This picture came to me, I think, from Gary Marty via Ron Hedrick. I didn't have one of these, but this is a significant condition for us on the West Coast. This is sardine viral hemorrhagic septicemia. So we know we've got sardines. We know that they've got red areas of necrosis, hemorrhage, and congestion in the skin, specifically of the ventral body wall, but literally anywhere on these fishes. This is another rhabdoviral infection. And this condition, like so many of these conditions, is associated with endothelial necrosis and then secondary hemorrhage. It's very similar to all the other sort of dead red grouping of fish viruses, but it's important because it's a recently identified, so it shows us that we're learning more about these viruses in fishes, and a significant condition in sardines, specifically off the west coast of the U.S. Neoplastic conditions in fishes are very significant, and they're significant because, remember, fish are excellent laboratory animal models. And when we're doing laboratory animal models, it's nice to have a fish species that both mimics conditions that we're interested in learning about and that can demonstrate carcinogenicity impacts. So it's a great idea to know about what's happening with specific fish neoplastic conditions. This was, when I first started learning about fish diseases, sort of the classic that everyone had to know about. This is a platyfish hybrid, and the way you can make melanomas in these fishes, and here's a melanoma here on the tail stalk of this fish is you take a platyfish and a swordtail. They're related but different species of fishes, and you interbreed them. You then take their offspring, so the F1 offspring, and breed them together. And when the hybrids, excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. Pardon me. When the hybrids, so the F1s have spotting, but the F2s, the interbred hybrids, tend to develop melanomas. And what's happened in those fish is they've lost some of the modifier genes that tend to restrict formation of tumors. So this was a wonderful way to demonstrate tumor generation via genetic modification. Well, genetic modifications come a little bit further, and the Zahn lab has now taken the zebrafish, and these are the leopard form of the zebrafish, and actually found ways to modify again genetic expression. And what we have in the areas where the stars are development of melanomas in zebrafish now as well. Again, sort of that was then, this is now kind of comparison. When I first learned about neoplastic condition in fishes, the classic lesion to know about was hepatic adenomas and adenocarcinomas in trout and salmonids. And the reason it was so important was because aflatoxicosis. We knew that in these species, hepatic adenomas were associated with aflatoxin B1, and that you could get development of hepatocellular carcinoma. What you're looking at here is a zebrafish with a hepatic adenoma. The tough thing is, this is a zebrafish with a hepatic adenocarcinoma. And I wish I had a good gross way to differentiate these, but in truth I really don't. To me, these look like we've got a pale fatty type area, and if you look in this area, we've got some hepatic tissue that looks a little bit funky but not terribly distorted, but under the microscopes where you're going to diagnose these cases. That's why zebrafish are so little. They fit very nicely onto a slide. So while gross diagnosis is important, certainly follow-up with histology is critical in these fishes. We still have interest with aflatoxin-associated carcinomas, but the classic conditions are now moving into sort of molecular science, such that the zebrafish are being the best models for hepatic carcinomas and adenomas. Jan Spitsbergen has done some very, very interesting work looking at these and looking at the impact of both environmental components as well as food components on both the expression and the development of these neoplastic conditions. And as time goes on, I think we're going to learn more and more about environmental impacts on different carcinogenicity conditions. I've got this guy in here just because I absolutely love this photo. This was given to me by Paul Bowser way back when the Earth was cooling. I was in veterinary school, and angelfish were identified with this sort of Angelina Jolie lesion. But it's a fibropapilloma. And we actually thought that these guys, it was going to be the end of angelfish because of the development of this neoplastic lesion on the faces of the angelfish. In truth, it hasn't impacted the industry very much, so it's sort of relegated to the area of gee whiz tumors, but it's a good one to know because you will see this in the hobby fish still today. These are not just a little bitty gee whiz thing. This is a great gross presentation of walleye dermal sarcoma. This is an interesting neoplastic condition in that we see this condition more pronounced in the fall of the year. It is associated with changes in dermal fibroblasts, and in these masses you can see not only typical fibroblastic type changes that are typical for a sarcoma, but there's also laking of osteoid-like material that you can see within these tumors themselves. These nodules tend to be multifocal, and what's interesting about them is that they're associated with a type C retrovirus. Another retroviral condition of import is this fantastic lesion here in the abdomen of a salmon. if I can get this arrow to work, this is a salmon swim bladder sarcoma. Now the swim bladder is located in the retroperitoneal space just below the vertebral column of these fishes. And if we could take that swim bladder out and fix it so you could get a better look, this is what you'd see. What we've got here within Atlantic salmon is an expansion of the swim bladder wall by this multinodular neoplastic sarcoma. And again, this condition is also associated with a retrovirus. How would you have an indication that this might be going on? Well, these fishes, obviously because they lose the normal functionality of their swim bladder, have a decrease in buoyancy. These neoplastic conditions can actually erode through the wall of the swim bladder, and you can have not only fish that sink, but fish that inappropriately float or float upside down because they no longer have air contained within their swim bladder. If it erodes into their coelom, these can be fishes with all sorts of interesting buoyancy issues. Just as a bit of a gee whiz, here we have a goldfish with an erythropheroma. And what's important to remember is fishes, like a lot of reptiles, have some unusual color-associated cells in their skin. So erythropheroma, chromatopheroma, just an interesting, neat neoplastic condition in a goldfish. Here we've got a salmon with a very impressive fibrosarcoma. And if you, take it back, fibroma. If you don't believe me, if we take him in cross-section, you can see that it extends from the muscle layer of this guy. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about brown bullheads in the neoplastic area. And I want to talk about them simply because brown bullheads have a propensity to develop oral cutaneous papillomas. And this is important because these fish are commonly used as environmental assessors. And what's important is just to know that we see these papillomas, they have been described, and simply seeing them doesn't mean that the fish are in a hugely polluted environment, but it certainly does bode interesting for further investigations of the impact of pollutants on development of these neoplastic changes. Let's move on from neoplastic changes. You've had enough lumps and bumps, and let's take a look finally at white-spotted fishes. Now, this is Ichthyophorus multifilus, and because that's such a mouthful, let's just call it ich. This is freshwater ich here in a catfish fry, and what you see across the body is white dots. It looks as though somebody powdered the fish. What's important when we're looking at these powdered fish is the fact that clinically these fish are irritated. They scratch on the bottom in a move called flashing. This is caused by ciliated parasites. It's the #1 condition of interest sort of when you get new fish for the home aquarist, but it's also a significant condition that's impacting hatchery fishes. Just last week, 250,000 trout in Idaho died of this parasitic condition, and the underlying problem was overcrowding. Overcrowding is common in hatchery conditions because when you have fry, you have lots of fry. So what's important is ich is a common freshwater condition, and it's a protozoal parasite. It's associated with a very limited sort of cutaneous dermatitis associated with the attachment sites of the organism. These fishes produce excessive mucus. Because the protozoa can also impact the gills, excessive mucus on the gills can impact the fish's ability to breathe. So this is a very significant infection. Marine species, not to be left out, have their own version of what we call marine ich, and this is a Cryptocaryon irritans infection. Now, interestingly, both marine and freshwater fishes have a rule-out disease called velvet disease, and it's called velvet because, again, the production of mucus in response to the parasitic dermatitis can cause sort of a velvety appearance to the surface of the fish. The way to diagnose this is either via wet mount or histopathology. Again, this is another holotrichid protozoa, causes epithelial hyperplasia and small erosions or ulcerations, but it's setting the fish up for secondary infections. It is impacting the fish such that it's irritated and doesn't want to eat, and it certainly can be a significant pathogenic condition in both freshwater and marine fishes. Now, there are a couple funky mixosporidians that are important, and this is Hennegaia. Hennegaia is a condition of freshwater fishes, and it generally is associated with gill infections. And what we see are formation of these xenomas, or big gill nodules associated with hyperplasia. It's also associated with cardiac lesions, and as with so many fish parasites, doing wet mounts or histologic evaluation is the way to do these diagnoses. Just a quick, I had to throw in one H&E, I couldn't help it, and it's because these xenomas are so beautiful They are located both within and between the secondary lamella of the fish gills. So I promise that's my only H&E, but it was too beautiful to not show. I've got another classic sort of lesion. You can tell it's classic because we start with a black and white photo. This is a disease everyone should know, and it's whirling disease. It's a myxozoan infection with Myxobolus cerebralis. It's very significant to a variety of salmonids, and it has a two-host life cycle. But what's nice about it is it has this great characteristic gross finding. The fish become bicolored. So if you look at these guys, these are little fry, and what you can appreciate is that their tails are darks and their bodies are light. And what happens is when we have infection in this area of the vertebral column, you get secondary discoloration of the tails of the fishes. And when the fish get bigger, you can actually have fry that look like this. So what's important is the organism Myxobolus cerebralis tends to like to grow within the cartilage, both the head cartilage as well as the vertebral cartilage of a variety of salmonids. It causes cartilage necrosis and then secondary discolored tails, spinal malformation. You saw sort of in that classic photo the bent shape to the body of that fish, and that it's caused by a myxozoan, and it's a common concern both of wild fishes and hatchery fishes. Now, if we take a look at zebrafish that are sort of bent, they've got their own problem, and it's associated with microsporidiosis. This is Pseudoloma neutrophilia, and Pseudoloma neutrophilia is a great disease of zebrafish because the name of the disease is skinny disease. And it's called skinny disease because when these fish are impacted, they become skinny. Now, you get development of xenomas in this condition too, but they tend to impact the hindbrain of the fishes and the spinal cord. And sort of the sporophorous vesicles containing the spores can be pretty significantly sized, and you find them in those areas. The lesion histologically involves both a significant myelitis and a myositis. And this is important again because zebrafish are of continued importance in the lab animal fields in the US. This is probably the best picture I have of a Glugia infection, and I think that's because many of the parasitic infections of fishes are very difficult to get good gross pictures of. What we see here are sort of these multiple cutaneous nodules here in the seahorse associated with the microsporidial infection of Glugia. Now, this is an obligate intracellular organism, and they tend to accumulate in these sporocysts. And what's interesting in the sporocysts is they become quite large and they form these xenomas again. Now, these are probably the best picture I have of the xenomas, but they really can be a problem because they have a direct life cycle. So when this guy should die, sometimes of the infection, as he sort of decomposes, he then can shed the organism and infect more of his tank mates. It impacts both fresh and saltwater fishes, and as I said, it is a common condition in seahorses. Now, I've got another condition here. Here we've got a fish, and I think off his chin, those are not unshaven whiskers, that's a Lernia infection. And Lernia is a crustacean, and it's a parasitic copepod. Like with so many fish parasites, it's important because it causes local areas of erosion and ulceration where it attaches, and when that happens, you've got a good area for secondary bacterial, fungal, even parasitic infections to jump in. Additionally, this worm, as with the next one we're about to see, can carry some infectious conditions such as viral infections. What we're looking at here on the back of this guy, that's not a spot, that's actually an argulus, known commonly as the fish louse. And this parasite can cause a fair number of secondary problems, and remember, it is the carrier of spring viremia of carp. This is a great parasitic condition, and it's a great parasitic condition because what we see here is a cataract within the eye of the salmonid. Whoop! I promise it's a cataract within the eye of that salmonid. It's caused by Diplostomum spathaceum. Diplostomum. And what's important is when you see cataract in fishes, there are a number of potential etiologies to think about. But when we have pond-raised fish, especially trout, it's important to look for these little flukes. And actually, if you look at this cataract, you can see small white flecks that likely are the flukes present within the Cataractus lens itself. The way this parasite works is it has a 3-host cycle. Fish eating birds have it present within their small intestine. They then shed it, and that life form is picked up by snails. The snails shed the cercaria, and the cercaria actually get into the fish, likely via the skin. That will cause irritation of the skin. The fish will flash. They'll have local cutaneous ulcerations as the cercaria are going in and forming metacercaria, and then those go to the eye and cause either endophthalmitis or, as in this case, cataract development. It's a digenic trematode, and you can have multiple flukes within a single lens, and it leads to blindness. Well, why is that important? Trout are sight feeders, so they need to see what they're eating. And you can imagine if you can't see it, you're not going to eat well. It really significantly impacts production. So it's good to know about eye flukes. One more sort of common gee whiz type condition, but an important one to know about, is nephrocalcinosis. And what I've got here is a picture of the kidneys from what we call a bony fish, or a teleost fish. And the reason I've got a teleost fish here is now I'm going to show you the kidneys from a ray. So this is from a cow-nose ray. And a cow-nose ray, all rays indeed, are elasmobranchs, or cartilaginous fishes. They tend to store their calcium not in their bones, but actually in their skin. Well, why am I showing you these two different fishes with these funky kidney lesions? Well, this is nephrocalcinosis. So what we have is significant mineral deposition within the renal parenchyma of both kinds of fishes. Now, both conditions need further evaluation, but here's what's funky about the rays. Not only do we have damage and essentially destruction of the renal parenchyma, but we can have metastatic calcification. So what you're looking at here is the heart of the ray. And here you can see this area is markedly sort of replaced by multifocal and coalescing areas of mineral deposits that obviously are significantly impacting the cardiac function in that animal. If anyone's looking for a great resident project, we'd really like to know more about this condition. We have tons and tons of samples, both clinical and postmortem. I'd really be delighted to have someone say, hey, I want to come solve the implications and significance of this condition, as well as determine what the heck's causing it. Let's move on to a couple more miscellaneous issues. And I put this in because I think this is probably the best gross presentation of this condition I can show you. This is nitrate toxicity. Nitrate toxicity is methemoglobinemia, and it's not uncommon, unfortunately, in fishes that are kept in ponds. What we find is when we have cooler water, we have a decrease in the denitrifying bacteria. Now, the denitrifying bacteria are really important in the way that sort of the water quality handles levels of ammonia that are present in the water system. In addition, when the water becomes cooler, we have a decrease in the dissolved oxygen. So it's kind of a two-pronged attack, or a double hit on these animals. When we have this, what we end up with is formation of methemoglobin and secondary mass fish kills, or mass fish die-offs. I'd like the last condition that we look at, sort of where I can show you pretty fishes with cool little lines and dots, to be hole in the head and lateral line disease. Now, what I'd like to look at is this condition where we have ulceration and loss of different cutaneous cells that are associated with the special sensory cells of the fish's skin. So fish have a variety of different cells along lateral and capital canals. And these cells are associated with the fish knowing sort of where it is in space, as well as sensing what's going on around it. What's important is there's necrosis and general ulceration of these cells. And for a long time, people have been trying to figure out what's the etiology of this condition. We see it in both aquarium fishes, as well as even large marine fishes that are kept in indoor enclosures. It was originally thought, hey, we've got this solved. We find this protozoa, Spironucleus vortans, present in a lot of these conditions. But remember, protozoa are very good at secondarily invading conditions. This could be a nutritional condition. It could be associated with stress. It may actually be associated with exposure to natural sunshine or UV light. We don't have a good answer for this, but certainly the wounds can become extensive, and I think when we have these extensive wounds, what we're seeing is the primary problem and then secondary ulceration and again expansion via secondary invaders jumping in on these guys. I've got one last photo of zebrafish, and remember this histosection doesn't count because it's got a gross picture on the same slide with it. What we're looking at here is a zebrafish, and it's probably the best photo I think that is in existence of gas bubble disease in fishes. Completely different from what we talked about earlier with marine mammals. The way this condition occurs is that the fishes are living within supersaturated water. Now the water can become supersaturated in a variety of different manners. It can be associated with faulty pumps. In other words, the pump is drawing in extra air as it's pumping water into the fish tank. And when that happens, it can cause too much dissolved oxygen to be present within the tank water. In cold water systems in particular, fast water systems going down raceways can really become agitated and take in too much air. And then if the water heats without proper off-gassing of the air, the fish, as they take it in via their gills, can literally take in supersaturated water, and then they have extra air within their system. This is essentially the fish version of the bends. What happens is these guys will, as the air goes through their system, it tends to fall out in the areas near the eye. And what we find, sorry about that, is that you get areas of both cavitation due to the air as well as hemorrhage secondary to the damage from the air that results in marked damage to these tissues. I want to leave you with some sort of one last gee whiz, and it's a gee whiz because it's an important case. What we're seeing here is a pink distension coming through the gill slits of this shark. And if you're presented with something like this, you have two potential rule-outs. And what's important is there's a pathologic condition, goiter. And we know a lot of sharks will have goiter associated with iodine deficiency. But there's a physiologic condition as well. And it is that many sharks can actually avert their stomachs. So this is actually not a goiter, but a stomach that is physiologically, a fish that is physiologically everting his stomach, we think sort of in an attempt to clean out things that are sort of feeling funky in there or to reduce parasites in that area. The take-home message of this slide is you want to make sure that you consider all the options, because if you see this and you put this fish on iodine, you're not going to do a darn thing to help him. And in truth, he can take that stomach and put it back almost any time he wants. Now, there is a secondary pathologic possibility here in that many sharks can avert both their stomach and their spiral valve. Sometimes their tank mates aren't so friendly and they'll actually bite that. So we can end up with pathology from this normal physiologic condition. But if you know about it, you won't mistake it for something like a goiter ever. I'd like to stop there with looking at gross fish pathology lesions at this time. I hope you feel comfortable now when you see a fish to know that there are some conditions that are similar, but a lot of conditions that are different. But if you sort of look at the clinical history of the fish, the conditions in which the fish are kept and its water quality, as well as your findings, and then use ancillary diagnostics like bacteriology, virus isolation, and virus investigations, as well as histology to evaluate your cases, you'll do a good job and you can make a difference in fish pathology. Thanks very much for your time and attention, and I hope you found this lecture helpful.